Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host. You may know me from Warm Pages. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. What's the weather like where you are tonight? And do you have a little evening ritual that helps you unwind? Share it with us. I truly enjoy reading your comments. And don't forget to subscribe. Now settle in. Our story begins. Chapter 1. The Bitter Wind and the Bad Neighbour. The fog rolled into Loughdoob like an uninvited guest, thick and sullen, wrapping itself around the whitewashed cottages and creeping along the waterfront with malicious intent. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood in the doorway of his small croft house, surveying the dismal scene with the philosophical detachment of a man who'd seen 30-odd Highland winters and knew that complaining about the weather was as useful as teaching a sheep to sing. He was a tall, gangly man with hazel eyes that held a deceptive sleepiness and red hair that no amount of brilliantine could tame. At this particular moment, he was wearing his second-best uniform, the first best being reserved for emergencies such as visits from his superior officer or funerals, and he was in no hurry whatsoever to exchange the comfort of his own doorstep for the dubious pleasures of police work. Behind him, his dog Lugs let out a contemplative yawn. Lugs was a large mongrel of indeterminate breeding, as with ears that stood up like radar dishes and a perpetually mournful expression that suggested he had just been informed of a distant relative's terminal illness. Beside Lugs sat Sonsie, Hamish's wild cat, who was about as domesticated as a Highland Gael and twice as unpredictable. The cat fixed Hamish with her yellow eyes, demanding breakfast with the imperious air of a dowager duchess. Aye, I'm getting to it, Hamish muttered, retreating into the warmth of the kitchen. A man can't even contemplate the miseries of winter without being nagged by his own beasts. He had just filled their bowls when he heard the crunch of tyres on gravel. Through the window he spotted the distinctive shape of the Curry twins' small car, driven with Nessie's characteristic caution, as though she were transporting nitroglycerin rather than herself and her sister Jessie. Hamish sighed. The twins only made house calls when there was gossip too momentous to wait for chance meetings in the village shop. He's a monster! That's what he is! Nessie Curry announced the moment Hamish opened the door, her thin face quivering with indignation. A monster? Echoed Jessie. And who might we be discussing? Hamish asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. That's Sir Hugo Sterling, Nessie said, investing the title with enough scorn to strip paint. Bought the castle, bought the title, thinks he's bought the whole of Loughdoob. The whole of Loughdoob, repeated Jessie, nodding vigorously. Hamish had heard about the new Laird, of course. In a village the size of Loughdoob, news travelled faster than midges in August. Sir Hugo Sterling, a corporate raider from London with more money than manners, had purchased the old castle and the defunct title that went with it. The castle had stood empty for years, a crumbling monument to better days, and the village had grown accustomed to its benign neglect. What's he done? Hamish asked, resigned to his fate. He was in the pub last night, Nessie said, her voice dropping to a scandalised whisper, insulting everyone, called Archie McLean a lazy drunkard. A lazy drunkard, confirmed Jessie. Well, Archie is a lazy drunkard, Hamish observed mildly. That's not the point, Nessie snapped. And he's threatening to foreclose on the harbour sheds, says the deeds aren't legal. Aren't legal, Jessie added, shaking her head. This was more serious. Now, the harbour sheds were the lifeblood of Loughdoo's small fishing community, passed down through generations with the casual informality of Highland tradition and little regard for London lawyers and their paperwork. I'd better have a word with him, Hamish said, though the prospect appealed to him about as much as a root canal performed by a tipsy dentist. You do that, Nessie said firmly, before there's real trouble. Real trouble, Jessie echoed ominously. After the twins departed, Hamish contemplated his options. He could walk down to the pub and attempt to reason with Sir Hugo, or he could attend to his sheep, which needed moving to the lower pasture before the weather worsened. The sheep won. They were more reasonable than most people, and considerably better company than belligerent Englishmen with delusions of feudal grandeur. He was halfway through the job with Lugs providing enthusiastic but unhelpful assistance, when he saw a small figure trudging up the hill toward him. Mrs. Mary Ross, the village librarian, was wrapped in a sensible tweed coat, her grey hair tucked beneath a wool hat. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Mr. Macbeth," she called out in her soft musical voice, "I thought you might appreciate some fresh scones. It's a bitter day." Hamish felt a surge of gratitude. Mary Ross was one of the genuinely kind souls in Lochdu, always thinking of others, always ready with a helping hand or a word of comfort. She ran the small village library with quiet efficiency, knew more about local history than anyone alive, and had never been heard to say an unkind word about anyone. "Mrs. Ross, you're an angel," Hamish said, accepting the basket. The scones were still warm, and the smell made his stomach rumble appreciatively. "I heard about the unpleasantness at the pub last night," Mary said, her gentle face troubled. "I tried to calm Sir Hugo down, but I'm afraid he wasn't in a listening mood. He's very upset about something in the castle records." "What sort of something?" "I couldn't quite make it out, but he was very agitated, going through all the old property deeds. I offered to help him with the research, but he became quite rude." She smiled sadly. "I served everyone tea afterward. Tempers were running rather high." "I appreciate you trying to keep the peace," Hamish said. "Well, we must all try to get along, mustn't we?" Mary said. "Yeah, even with difficult people. I'm sure once Sir Hugo settles in, he'll become part of the community." Hamish doubted this very much, but he nodded politely. Mary bid him goodbye and made her way back down the hill, her small figure soon swallowed by the fog. That evening Hamish finally made his way to the pub. The atmosphere was thick with resentment and cigarette smoke. Sir Hugo Sterling sat in the corner booth like a toad on a throne, a heavy-set man with small, suspicious eyes and the kind of fleshy face that suggested too many rich dinners and not enough exercise. "So, you're the village Bobby," Sir Hugo said when Hamish approached, looking him up and down with undisguised contempt. "You look more like a scarecrow than a police officer." "Aye, well, we cannae all afford London tailors," Hamish replied mildly. "I want something done about these people," Sir Hugo said, waving his hand dismissively at the other patrons, who were watching with barely concealed hostility. "They're squatting on my property. Those harbour sheds are legally mine, and I intend to claim them." "Perhaps we could discuss this more calmly," Hamish began. "There's nothing to discuss. I've consulted with my lawyers. The deeds are invalid. The sheds will be demolished by the end of the month." A dangerous murmur ran through the pub. Archie MacLean, his weathered face red with anger, half rose from his seat. Hamish quickly moved to intercept him. "Now, Archie, let's not be hasty." "That bastard's going to destroy our livelihoods," Archie snarled. Sir Hugo smiled unpleasantly. "If you fishermen had spent less time drinking and more time reading contracts, you wouldn't be in this position." Hamish spent the next hour preventing an outright brawl, eventually persuading Sir Hugo to retreat to his castle and the locals to nurse their grievances with whisky instead of violence. By the time he trudged back to his croft house through the bitter fog, he was thoroughly exhausted. "Mark my words, Lugs," he said to the dog as they settled in for the night. "That man is going to cause nothing but trouble." Lugs, with the wisdom of his species, simply yawned and went to sleep. Hamish wished he could do the same, but sleep was a long time coming. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like something living, and somewhere in the darkness the wind howled across the loch like a warning. Chapter 2. Death in the Locked Library. Hamish was dreaming of a promotion he didn't want when the hammering on his door woke him. It was barely 7 in the morning, and the grey light seeping through his curtain suggested the fog had decided to take up permanent residence in Lochdu. "Police! Mr. Macbeth! You must come at once!" Hamish recognised the voice of Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, a formidable woman who ran the church jumble sales with the strategic brilliance of a military campaign. If she was rattled enough to abandon the proper forms of address, something serious had happened. He threw on his clothes and opened the door to find Mrs. Wellington on his doorstep, her usually ruddy face pale as porridge. "It's Sir Hugo," she gasped. "He's dead. Murdered." In the castle library. Hamish's pleasant dreams of lazy mornings evaporated like morning mist. "Are you certain he's dead?" "His head's been bashed in with something heavy. There's blood everywhere." Mrs. Wellington swayed slightly, and Hamish guided her to a chair. "Who found him?" "Mrs. Dunn, the housekeeper. She went in to clean this morning and started screaming. Half the village heard her." Hamish made a quick phone call to Strathbane, knowing even as he did so that his peaceful existence was about to be thoroughly disrupted. Then he grabbed his regulation-peaked cap, told Lugs to guard the house, and hurried toward the castle with Mrs. Wellington puffing along behind him. The castle loomed out of the fog like something from a Gothic novel, all grey stone and narrow windows. A small crowd had already gathered in the courtyard, talking in hushed, excited voices. Hamish spotted Archie MacLean among them, looking hungover and bewildered. Mrs. Dunn, a stout woman in her 60s, sat on a stone bench with Mary Ross beside her, holding her hand and murmuring words of comfort. Mary looked up as Hamish approached, her gentle face drawn with concern. "Oh, Mr. Macbeth, it's terrible," she said softly. "Poor Mrs. Dunn is quite overcome." "I'll need to speak with her in a moment," Hamish said. "But first I need to see the body. Has anyone touched anything?" "I locked the library door as soon as I saw what had happened," Mrs. Dunn managed between sobs, "the keys in my apron pocket still." "That's very sensible of you," Hamish said, taking the heavy iron key. "Mrs. Ross, would you mind staying with Mrs. Dunn?" "Keep everyone else outside." Mary nodded, her expression grave. "Of course, whatever I can do to help." Hamish made his way through the castle's gloomy corridors, his footsteps echoing on the stone floors. The library was on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway lined with portraits of disapproving ancestors. The heavy oak door was indeed locked, and when Hamish opened it and stepped inside, he understood why Mrs. Dunn had screamed. Sir Hugo Sterling lay sprawled on the Persian carpet, his skull crushed by what appeared to be a heavy, antique cast-iron peat cutter that now lay beside him, dark with blood. The implement had been part of a local heritage display, Hamish recalled, one of those romantic notions about preserving Highland culture that museums were so fond of. The library itself was a handsome room, lined with books and furnished with leather chairs and a massive desk. One of the tall windows was slightly open, letting in tendrils of fog, but it was a good 30 feet above the courtyard and offered no practical means of escape. What struck Hamish immediately was the door. From the inside he could see the heavy iron bolt that had been drawn across it. The bolt was on the inside of the door, and there was no way it could have been manipulated from the corridor. The windows were too high for anyone to have climbed out, and there were no other exits from the room. A classic locked room mystery, Hamish thought, with a sinking feeling. Just what he needed. He was examining the bolt mechanism when he heard vehicles in the courtyard below. Through the window he saw the arrival of Detective Chief Inspector Blair of the Strathbane Police, emerging from his car like a malevolent toad from its hole. Blair was everything Hamish despised in a superior officer, fat, red-faced, perpetually reeking of whiskey, and blessed with the kind of vindictive incompetence that made a man dangerous. He hated Hamish with a passion born of professional jealousy, for while Blair bullied and blundered his way through investigations, Hamish had an unfortunate habit of solving crimes through a combination of local knowledge and what Blair scornfully called peasant cunning. By the time Blair wheezed his way up to the library, Hamish had completed his initial examination of the scene. The blood spatter suggested a single, powerful blow. There were no signs of a struggle. Sir Hugo had been struck from behind, probably never knowing what hit him. "Well, well, aye, if it isn't our local hero," Blair sneered, his small eyes gleaming with malice. "I suppose you've already solved it, Macbeth?" "Just securing the scene, sir," Hamish said mildly. "The body's as it was found. Mrs. Dunn, the housekeeper, discovered him at approximately 7 this morning." "Aye, well, stand aside and let the professionals handle it," Blair said, shouldering past him. He stopped short when he saw the body, his face turning an interesting shade of purple. Christ almighty! The forensics team arrived shortly after, along with Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson, Blair's long-suffering second-in-command. Jimmy was a decent sort, afflicted with an unfortunate weakness for whiskey and an even more unfortunate superior officer. He caught Hamish's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible shrug that said clearer than words, "Here we go again." "Right," Blair announced, having recovered his composure. "I want statements from everyone in the village. Everyone. That bastard was threatening half of Loch-Dubh from what I hear, so we've got suspects aplenty." "The door was bolted from the inside, sir," Hamish pointed out. "It's a puzzle how the killer got out." "I don't need you to tell me my job, Macbeth," Blair snapped. "Probably some trick with string or magnets. These locked room things always are. What matters is motive, and this English bastard gave half the village reason to want him dead." While Blair strutted about issuing orders and making general nuisance of himself, Hamish slipped downstairs to question Mrs. Dunn properly. He found her in the kitchen with Mary Ross, who had thoughtfully produced a pot of tea and was serving it to the gathered Strathbane detectives with quiet efficiency. "You're very kind, Mrs. Ross," said one of the younger officers gratefully. "It's the least I can do," Mary replied softly. "Such a terrible thing to happen." Mrs. Dunn had little to add to her original statement. She'd arrived at 7, as usual, and had gone to clean the library first. The door had been locked, which was odd, but she had a master key. When she opened the door and saw Sir Hugo lying there, she'd screamed and run. "Did you see or hear anything unusual last night?" Hamish asked gently. "I don't live in the castle, Mr. Macbeth. I go home at 6 every evening. Sir Hugo preferred his privacy in the evenings. Said he had important work to do." "What kind of work?" "Going through all the old estate papers he was. Obsessed with them. Had them spread all over the library. Very particular about not touching anything." After Mrs. Dunn left, Mary approached Hamish with a folded piece of paper. "I've prepared a list for Detective Chief Inspector Blair," she said. "All the local people Sir Hugo had disputes with yesterday. I thought it might save time." Hamish took the list and scanned it. There was Archie McLean, of course. Dr. Brodie, who'd had words with Sir Hugo about some medical matter. Several of the fishermen whose sheds were threatened. Even old Angus MacDonald, the seer, though Hamish couldn't imagine what dispute they might have had. "This is very thorough, Mrs. Ross," Hamish said. "I was in the pub yesterday evening, you see, trying to keep the peace. I'm afraid I witnessed most of the unpleasantness." She looked troubled. "Do you really think one of our people could have done this?" "I think," Hamish said carefully, "that things are rarely as simple as they seem." Blair emerged from the library in a foul temper, barking orders at his subordinates. He snatched the list from Hamish's hand. "Right, this is more like it. We'll start bringing them in for questioning. Someone in this god-forsaken village killed that man, and I intend to find out who." "The locked door," Hamish began. "Is irrelevant," Blair interrupted. "Some clever trick, that's all. The killer is on this list, mark my words." As the Strathbane police began their heavy-handed interrogations, Hamish slipped away, his mind already working through the puzzle. A locked room, a violent death, Woola and a victim who'd managed to antagonize an entire village in less than 24 hours. It was going to be a long investigation, and he had a sinking feeling that before it was over, Blair would arrest half of Loch-Dubh in his eagerness to close the case. The fog showed no signs of lifting. Chapter 3. Sifting the Highland Gossip. The following morning dawned no brighter than the previous one, the fog having apparently decided that Loch-Dubh suited it very well indeed. Hamish stood in his kitchen, frying eggs for himself, and preparing the less elegant meals favoured by Lugs and Sonsy, while contemplating the peculiar problem of a man murdered in a locked room. Blair, he knew, would charge ahead like a bull in a china shop, arresting anyone who'd so much as looked at Sir Hugo sideways. It was up to Hamish to find the truth before some innocent villager ended up in a cell, and that meant doing what he did best. Listening to gossip, observing people, and thinking. He decided to start with the Curry twins, who knew everything that happened in Loch-Dubh before it actually happened, or so it sometimes seemed. Nessie and Jessie lived in a neat cottage near the harbour, surrounded by garden gnomes and wind chimes that tinkled discordantly in the breeze. They answered the door in perfect unison, two thin, elderly women with identical expressions of avid curiosity. "Mr. Macbeth, we've been expecting you," Nessie said, ushering him into a sitting room so cluttered with antimacassars and porcelain figurines that Hamish feared to move lest he destroy some cherished heirloom. "Expecting you?" echoed Jessie. "I thought you might have some information about Sir Hugo's movements yesterday," Hamish began, accepting a cup of tea that appeared as if by magic. "We saw him arguing with a young man near the harbour," Nessie said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "About 4 in the afternoon it was." 4 in the afternoon, Jessie confirmed. "Can you describe this young man?" "30s, well-dressed, expensive coat. Not from around here. Not from around here." "Did you hear what they were arguing about?" Nessie shook her head. "Too far away." But the young man was angry, waving his arms about. Sir Hugo just stood there sneering at him, the way he did at everyone. "The way he did at everyone," Jessie agreed with satisfaction. This was interesting. Hamish made a mental note to investigate further. After extracting himself from the twins with promises to keep them informed, he made his way to the small cottage where Angus MacDonald lived in splendid squalor. Angus was reputed to have the second sight, a claim that brought tourists to his door with embarrassing regularity. Hamish, who privately thought Angus had nothing more supernatural than a good pair of binoculars and an excellent network of informants, nevertheless found him useful for gathering information. The old man was sitting by his peat fire, smoking a villainous pipe, and looking suitably mystical for any tourists who might wander by. "I've been expecting ye, Hamish," Angus intoned in his doom-laden voice. "Aye, I'm sure you have, seeing as half the village probably told you I was asking questions," Hamish replied, settling into a chair that creaked alarmingly. "What can you tell me about Sir Hugo Sterling?" Angus's eyes gleamed. "I had a vision about that man. Saw his death, I did, 3 days ago." "Did you now? And did this vision happen to include any useful details, like who killed him?" "The spirits don't work that way, laddie. They show what they will." Angus paused dramatically. "But I can tell you this. That man had secrets. Dark secrets. And secrets have a way of getting people killed." "What kind of secrets?" "The kind that involve money and land and things done in the past that people would rather stay buried." This was frustratingly vague, even for Angus, but Hamish persevered. "Did you see him arguing with anyone?" "Aye, with that nephew of his. Callum Sterling came up from Edinburgh. Saw them myself, down by the old kirk. The nephew was demanding money, said it was his by rights." "When was this?" "Day before yesterday, and I saw Sir Hugo going through papers at the castle late at night, lights burning in the library till all hours." Hamish absorbed this information. A mysterious young man, a nephew demanding money, and Sir Hugo obsessed with old documents. The picture was becoming clearer, though not necessarily simpler. He spent the rest of the morning making the rounds of the village, gathering fragments of information like a magpie collecting shiny objects. At the post office, he learned that Sir Hugo had received several registered letters from Edinburgh lawyers. At the bakery, he discovered that the man had been buying enormous quantities of food, suggesting he was expecting visitors or planning to stay for some time. By noon, Hamish was ready to tackle the delicate problem of obtaining official information from the Strathbane police without alerting Blair to his unofficial investigation. This required Jimmy Anderson and a bottle of whiskey, not necessarily in that order. He found Jimmy in the mobile incident room that had been set up in the castle courtyard, looking harassed and yearning for escape. Hamish made a subtle gesture toward the village pub, and Jimmy's face brightened considerably. 20 minutes later, they were ensconced in a quiet corner of the bar, and Hamish was pouring a generous measure of single malt into Jimmy's glass. "You're a saint, Hamish," Jimmy said, taking a grateful sip. "Blair's been like a bear with a sore head all morning, screaming at everyone, threatening to arrest half the village. Has the autopsy report come through?" "Aye, preliminary findings. Single blow to the back of the head, delivered with considerable force. Death would have been instantaneous. The weapon was definitely that antique peat cutter. Time of death? between 9 and midnight last night. The pathologist can't be more specific than that. Hamish poured another dram. What about the locked door? Jimmy shook his head. That's the puzzle, right enough. Blair's convinced it's some kind of trick, but the forensics team can't find any evidence of tampering with the bolt or the lock. It was genuinely secured from the inside. So either the killer had a way out we haven't found, or Sir Hugo bolted himself in with his murderer, Jimmy finished, which seems unlikely. Unless he knew and trusted his killer, Jimmy considered this. Possible, I suppose. But who in Loch Dubh would Sir Hugo trust? The man had insulted everyone in the village. What about this nephew, Callum Sterling? Blair's brought him in for questioning. Turned up this morning, bold as brass, claiming he'd come to pay his respects. Seemed more interested in the will than in mourning his uncle. Hamish filed this away. Has Blair settled on a favourite suspect yet? Archie McLean. There were boot prints near the back entrance of the castle, and they match Archie's wellies. Plus, Blair found out about the argument they had at the pub. You know Blair. He likes the obvious answer. Archie's boots are the same as half the men in Loch Dubh wear, Hamish protested. I know that, and you know that. But try telling Blair. He's convinced he's got his man. After extracting a promise from Jimmy to keep him informed of any developments, Hamish walked back through the village, his mind churning. The fog was finally beginning to lift, revealing the loch in all its grey, forbidding glory. The problem, as Hamish saw it, was not a shortage of suspects, but a surplus of them. Sir Hugo had antagonised enough people to fill a police line-up. But the locked door suggested calculation and planning, not a crime of passion. Someone had thought this through very carefully. He was so deep in thought that he almost walked past Mary Ross, who was coming out of the library carrying a stack of books. "Mr. Macbeth," she called softly. "Any progress?" "Slow and steady, Mrs. Ross," Hamish replied. "These things take time. I've been thinking about what you said, about things not being as simple as they seem." She hesitated. "There's something you should know. Sir Hugo came to see me at the library the day before he died. He was asking about Jacobite gold." "Jacobite gold? It's an old legend. After Culloden, some of the fleeing Jacobites supposedly hid gold and valuables in various Highland castles. Sir Hugo was convinced there was treasure hidden somewhere in the castle, and he wanted to search the historical records. Did you help him?" "I showed him what we had, but there's nothing in the archives about any hidden gold. I think it was just a fancy on his part." She smiled sadly. Perhaps he thought finding treasure would make him feel like a real Highland laird. Or perhaps, Hamish said slowly, someone else thought there was treasure worth killing for. Mary's eyes widened. Oh, surely not. That would be dreadful. But as Hamish watched her walk away, he couldn't help thinking that treasure, real or imagined, had been the motive for murder since the beginning of time. The fog might be lifting, but the case was getting murkier by the minute. Chapter 4. The Blackmailer's Ledger. The official autopsy report arrived 2 days later, confirming what Hamish had already suspected. Sir Hugo Sterling had died from a single, powerful blow to the back of the skull, delivered with the kind of precision that suggested either luck or familiarity with human anatomy. The angle of the wound indicated the killer had struck from a standing position, ruling out any theory of an accidental fall onto the peat cutter. Hamish read the report in the privacy of his police station, which was really just the front room of his croft house, with a desk and a filing cabinet added. Lugs dozed at his feet, occasionally twitching in dreams of rabbits, while Sonsi watched the proceedings with her usual air of feline superiority. "So we're definitely looking at murder," Hamish said to his animals, who received this news with their customary indifference. "The question is how the killer got out of that locked room." The problem nagged at him like a sawtooth. He'd examined that library from floor to ceiling, and there was simply no way out except through the door. The windows were too high, the walls were solid stone, and there were no convenient secret passages like in a Gothic novel. Yet the door had been bolted from the inside with no sign of tampering, which meant either the killer had discovered a method Hamish hadn't found yet, or the whole locked room scenario was an elaborate piece of misdirection. His musings were interrupted by the telephone. It was Jimmy Anderson, speaking in a low, conspiratorial voice. "Hamish, I've got something you might want to see. Can you meet me at the castle in an hour? And for God's sake." "Come in the back way. Blair's in a foul mood." "When is Blair not in a foul mood?" "Fair point. Just be discreet, aye." An hour later, Hamish slipped through the castle's servants' entrance and found Jimmy waiting in what had once been the butler's pantry. The detective inspector looked unusually excited, which in Jimmy's case meant he'd found something either very interesting or very alcoholic. "What have you got?" Hamish asked. "Come with me, but quiet, mind. Blair's upstairs terrorising Mrs. Dunn about her cleaning schedule." Jimmy led him to the library, which was still cordoned off with police tape. The blood had been cleaned up, but the room retained an air of violence, as though the very walls remembered what had happened. "Look at this," Jimmy said, going to the bookshelves and running his hand along a row of leather-bound volumes. "See anything odd?" Hamish examined the books. They were old, valuable editions of Scottish history, arranged in what appeared to be chronological order. "Nothing jumps out." "Exactly, because it's not the books themselves. It's this." Jimmy pulled on what appeared to be a book spine, and a section of the shelf swung open to reveal a small wall safe. Forensics found it yesterday. Clever bit of work, that. The spine's a fake, attached to the safe door. What's inside? That's the interesting bit. Jimmy produced a leather-bound ledger from an evidence bag. Sir Hugo's personal records, and Hamish. The man wasn't just a corporate raider, he was a blackmailer. Hamish took the ledger and leafed through it. His expression growing grimmer with each page. It was all there, meticulously documented. Research into the backgrounds of various Lochdoub residents, secrets unearthed, and carefully calculated demands for money or property in exchange for silence. He researched everyone's land deeds and property claims, Jimmy explained. Found irregularities, forged documents, questionable transfers going back generations. Then he used that information to force people to sign over their properties for practically nothing. Called it renegotiating terms, but it was blackmail, pure and simple. Hamish found Archie McLean's name in the ledger. Sir Hugo had discovered that Archie had been skimming money from his fishing business and hiding it from his wife in a separate bank account. The amount wasn't large, but exposure would have meant divorce and ruin. "There's more," Jimmy said. "Dr. Brodie's in there too, something about a medical error that was covered up years ago, and others. Half the village is in this book." "Does Blair know about this?" "Oh, aye, he knows. He's practically dancing with joy. Says it gives everyone a motive, which in his mind means he can arrest whoever he likes and make something stick." Hamish photographed several pages with his mobile phone while Jimmy looked the other way. "What about forensic evidence? Fingerprints on the safe?" "Wiped clean. Whoever killed Sir Hugo knew about this ledger and tried to access the safe afterward. Didn't manage it, though. It's a good lock, and you need the combination." "How did forensics open it?" Mrs. Dunn found the combination written on a slip of paper in Sir Hugo's bedroom. He'd hidden it inside a book on his nightstand. Jimmy grinned. Not as clever as he thought he was. After Jimmy returned to his duties, Hamish remained in the library thinking. The ledger changed everything. What had seemed like a village united against an outside threat was actually a collection of individuals, each with their own desperate reasons for wanting Sir Hugo dead. He was about to leave when he noticed something odd near the fireplace. The flagstones weren't quite flush with each other, leaving a small gap. Hamish knelt and examined it more closely. There, caught in the crack, was a fibre of some kind. He extracted it carefully with his penknife. It was red and woolly, like yarn from a knitted garment. He bagged it carefully and slipped it into his pocket just as he heard heavy footsteps in the corridor. Blair's voice boomed through the castle. "Macbeth, I know you're skulking about somewhere. Get out here." Hamish emerged from the library to find Blair standing in the hallway, his face purple with rage and whiskey fumes. "What are you doing in my crime scene?" Blair demanded. "Just having a wee look around, sir. Thought I might notice something." "You thought wrong. This is a Strathbane investigation and you're to keep your long nose out of it, understand?" Perfectly, sir. Good, because I'm about to make an arrest and I won't have you muddying the waters with your Highland mumbo-jumbo. Blair looked smugly satisfied. We found boot prints, we found motive in that ledger, and we found opportunity. Archie McLean's going to jail. On what evidence, sir? The boot prints could belong to anyone. On the evidence that he threatened Sir Hugo in public, that he had the most to lose if his secret came out, and that he can't account for his whereabouts at the time of death. That's enough for me. But the locked door is irrelevant. He probably tricked Sir Hugo into letting him in, killed him, then jimmied the bolt somehow on his way out. We'll figure out the details later. Blair stomped off, leaving Hamish standing in the corridor, fury building in his chest. Blair was going to railroad an innocent man just to close the case quickly and claim the credit. Hamish made his way back to the police station, his mind racing. He needed to find the real killer before Archie ended up in a cell, but the evidence was fragmentary at best. Then a blackmailer's ledger, a locked room, a mysterious young man, and a piece of red wool. He spread his notes on the desk and stared at them, trying to find a pattern. Luggs wandered over and put his head on Hamish's knee, offering wordless sympathy. "Someone in Loch Dubh is a murderer," Hamish said quietly. "Someone who planned this carefully, who knew the castle well enough to navigate it in the dark, who knew where that peat cutter was displayed." The red wool fibre bothered him. It wasn't much, but it was something. He'd seen someone wearing a red cardigan recently, but he couldn't quite place who. The telephone rang, startling him. It was Mary Ross, her gentle voice concerned. "Mr. Macbeth? I just heard that Detective Chief Inspector Blair is planning to arrest Archie. Is it true?" "I'm afraid so, Mrs. Ross. But Archie couldn't have done it. He's a good man, just henpecked and fond of his drink. He'd never commit murder." "I don't think he did either. But Blair's not interested in the truth, just in closing the case." There was a pause. "Is there anything I can do to help? I feel so useless." "Actually, there is. You know the village history better than anyone. Can you think of anyone who might have had access to the castle before Sir Hugo bought it? Someone who knew the building well?" "Oh, several people. Mrs. Dunn worked there for years when the previous owners had it. And I used to visit occasionally when I was younger. They allowed me access to the old documents for my historical research." "Anyone else?" "Dr. Brodie used to treat the old Laird before he died. And Angus MacDonald claims he worked there as a groundskeeper in his youth, though I'm not sure I believe him." Hamish thanked her and hung up, his thoughts churning. The net was widening, but he was no closer to identifying the killer. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Another storm was coming. Chapter 5, Expanding the Suspect Pool. Blair's arrest of Archie McLean happened with all the subtlety of a bull elephant at a tea party. The detective chief inspector arrived at Archie's cottage at dawn, accompanied by 4 uniformed officers, and hauled the bewildered fisherman out of bed while his wife shrieked abuse from the doorway. Hamish heard about it from the Curry twins, who had witnessed the entire spectacle from their vantage point across the street, and had immediately rushed to inform him. "It was disgraceful," Nessie declared, her voice quivering with indignation. "Disgraceful," Jessie echoed. 4 policemen for 1 wee fisherman," Nessie continued, as if Archie was some kind of dangerous criminal. Dangerous criminal. Hamish drove to Strathbane that afternoon, ostensibly to deliver some paperwork, but actually to check on Archie. He found the fisherman in an interview room, looking small and frightened, his weathered face grey with exhaustion. "I didn't do it, Hamish," Archie said the moment he saw him. "I swear on my mother's grave I never killed that man." "I know you didn't, Archie. Just tell me where you were that night." Archie's face crumpled. "I was hiding in the pub cellar from my wife. She'd found out about the money I'd been putting aside, and she was in a right fury. I knew if I went home there'd be hell to pay, so I snuck down to the cellar and stayed there all night. Can anyone confirm this? The landlord might have heard me, but I didn't want to bother him, so I kept quiet. I'm sorry, Hamish. I know it sounds feeble." It did sound feeble, but Hamish believed him. Archie McLean might be a drunk and a coward when it came to his wife, but he wasn't a murderer. On his way out, Hamish encountered Jimmy Anderson in the corridor. "Blair's like a dog with a bone," Jimmy said quietly. "Won't listen to reason. He's convinced Archie's guilty, and that's that." "What about the other suspects? Has he even looked at them?" "Superficially. Dr. Brodie has an alibi. He was playing cards with Reverend Wellington until midnight, and that nephew, Callum Sterling, has traffic camera footage placing him 50 miles away at the time of death." "What's Callum's story?" "Claims he came to Lochdoub to reconcile with his uncle. Apparently there'd been a family rift years ago over money. Callum's father was Sir Hugo's brother, died in debt, and Hugo refused to help the family. Callum wanted what he felt was owed to him. Did Sir Hugo agree? Not according to Callum. They had a blazing row by the harbour. The Curry twins weren't wrong about that. But Callum says he left in anger and drove back to Edinburgh. The cameras back him up." After leaving Strathbane, Hamish decided it was time to speak with Dr. Brodie directly. The doctor's surgery was a neat stone building on the edge of the village, with a small garden that the doctor's wife tended with military precision. Dr. Brodie was a tall, thin man in his 60s, with the kind of precise, careful manner that came from years of dealing with Highland hypochondriacs. He received Hamish in his consulting room with wary politeness. "I've already spoken to the Strathbane police," he said. "I know, Doctor, but I'm trying to get a fuller picture of what happened." "Sir Hugo had something on you, didn't he?" Dr. Brodie's face tightened. "I suppose it'll all come out eventually. Yes, he was blackmailing me. There was an incident 15 years ago. A patient died under my care, an old woman with a heart condition. I made a judgment call about her medication that, in hindsight, may have been the wrong one. There was no formal investigation, but Hugo somehow found the records and threatened to report me to the medical board unless I signed over a piece of land my father had left me." "Did you sign?" "I was planning to. The land meant nothing to me, and my reputation meant everything." The doctor met Hamish's eyes steadily. "But I didn't kill him. I was with Reverend Wellington that entire evening playing bridge. We didn't finish until after midnight, and by then I was in no condition to walk, let alone commit murder. I'd had rather more whiskey than was wise." Hamish made a note to confirm this with the Reverend, though he suspected it was true. Dr. Brodie might have had motive, but he lacked the cold calculation required for this particular murder. His next stop was the castle itself, where he hoped to have another look at the library without Blair's interference. He found Mrs. Dunn in the kitchen, looking considerably less shattered than she had 2 days ago. "Mr. Macbeth," she greeted him. "I suppose you've come to poke about the scene again." "If you don't mind, Mrs. Dunn, I promise not to disturb anything." "Well, at least you're polite about it, unlike that Inspector Blair. Come on then." "Though I don't know what you expect to find that the fancy forensics people didn't." As they walked through the castle corridors, Hamish asked, "Did you know Sir Hugo well?" "As well as anyone could know such a man. He was cold, Mr. Macbeth. Not just unfriendly, but genuinely cold inside. He took pleasure in other people's misfortunes. I once saw him smile when he told a crofter his land claim was invalid. Actually smiled." "Did he have any visitors the night he died?" "Not that I know of, but I leave at 6 every evening. He could have had half of Edinburgh visiting after that, and I wouldn't know." In the library, Hamish conducted a methodical search, paying particular attention to the area around the fireplace where he'd found the red wool fibre. The flagstones were solid, with no hint of hidden passages or trap-doors. The windows remained stubbornly 30 feet above the courtyard, with no convenient drain pipes or ivy to climb. He examined the bolt on the door once more. It was a simple iron slide, impossible to manipulate from outside once it was closed. Yet someone had managed to escape this room after killing Sir Hugo Sterling, and Hamish was beginning to suspect that understanding how was the key to understanding who. As he left the castle, he nearly collided with Mary Ross, who was carrying a cardboard box. "Oh, Mr. Macbeth. I'm sorry. I didn't see you there. My fault entirely, Mrs. Ross. What brings you to the castle?" "Mrs. Dunn asked me to collect some historical documents that Sir Hugo had borrowed from the library. Now that they're not needed. She thought I should take them back." Mary shifted the box awkwardly. "They're quite heavy, I'm afraid." Let me help you with that." Hamish took the box and walked with her toward the village. Did Sir Hugo borrow documents often? Oh, yes. He was quite obsessed with the castle's history, particularly with the period after Culloden. He was convinced there was treasure hidden somewhere. She sighed. I tried to tell him it was just legend, but he wouldn't listen. Did he find anything interesting in these documents? I don't think so. They're mostly property deeds and transfer records from the 18th century. Terribly dull, really, unless you're interested in feudal land law. They reached the library, and Hamish set the box down on Mary's desk. The small building smelled pleasantly of old paper and furniture polish, and Mary busied herself making tea as she always did when she had a visitor. "I heard about poor Archie," she said, handing Hamish a cup. "It's terrible. Everyone knows he couldn't have done it. Blair needs someone to blame, and Archie's convenient. But surely the evidence doesn't support it. The locked door alone should be enough to raise doubt." "You'd think so, but Blair's not one for being troubled by inconvenient facts." Hamish sipped his tea. "Mrs. Ross, you mentioned you used to visit the castle when you were younger. Did you know it well?" "Fairly well. The old Laird used to let me use the library there for my research. This was years ago, mind you, before I became the village librarian. I was writing a history of Lockdoob for the Highland Society." She smiled wistfully. "I spent many happy afternoons in that library. Seems dreadful that it should be the scene of such violence now. Did you ever notice anything unusual about the room? Any oddities in the construction?" Mary thought for a moment. "Not that I recall. It was just a library. Books, a desk, fireplace, the usual things. Why do you ask?" "Just trying to understand how the killer escaped." "Yes, that is peculiar, isn't it? Almost like something from one of my mystery novels." She gestured to a shelf of well-worn paperbacks. "I'm quite fond of Agatha Christie, but in real life I suppose murders are much more sordid and sad." Hamish finished his tea and took his leave, promising to keep Mary informed of any developments. As he walked back to his police station, he turned the case over in his mind like a Rubik's Cube, trying to find the pattern that would make everything click into place. Archie had motive, but no opportunity. Dr. Brodie had motive, but a solid alibi. Callum Sterling had motive, but was provably elsewhere when his uncle died. And somewhere in this mix was a killer who had found a way to commit murder in a locked room and walk away unseen. The sun was setting over the loch, painting the water in shades of copper and grey. It would have been beautiful if Hamish hadn't been so preoccupied with murder. Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. The rain arrived that night with typical Highland enthusiasm, hammering on the roof of Hamish's croft house and turning the unpaved roads into rivers of mud. Hamish lay awake listening to it, his mind refusing to settle, turning over the facts of the case like stones in a river. By morning, the rain had eased to a steady drizzle, and Hamish was no closer to solving the mystery. He fed lugs and sonsie, made himself a breakfast that consisted mostly of strong tea, and was contemplating the dismal prospect of paperwork when his telephone rang. It was the landlord of the Lockdoob pub, a taciturn man named Donald who rarely called unless something was seriously amiss. "Hamish, you'd better come down here. There's something you should see." Hamish found Donald in the pub cellar, standing next to a makeshift bed of old blankets and empty whiskey bottles. The evidence of Archie's night in hiding was clear enough, and Hamish felt a surge of relief. This might be enough to shake Blair's certainty, if not his stubborn pride. "I didn't think anything of it at the time," Donald said. "Thought maybe it was rats or the like. But then I heard about Archie being arrested, and I put two and two together." "When did you discover this?" "This morning, when I came down to change a barrel. But now that I think on it, I heard noises down here the night Sir Hugo was killed. Around 10 o'clock it was, scraping and shuffling." "You didn't investigate?" Donald shrugged. "I thought it was Archie hiding from his wife again. Happens about once a month. I let him be." Hamish photographed the scene and took a statement from Donald, then drove back to Strathbane to present this new evidence to Jimmy Anderson. Blair predictably dismissed it. So he was in a pub cellar, Blair sneered. Doesn't mean he couldn't have nipped out, killed Sir Hugo and nipped back. The pub's only 10 minutes from the castle. The landlord heard him at 10 o'clock, Hamish protested. That's during the window when the murder occurred. Heard something. Could have been rats, like he said. Not good enough, Macbeth. Hamish left Strathbane in a foul mood, which wasn't improved when his mobile phone rang and the Curry twins informed him, in their distinctive stereo fashion, that Dr. Brodie had been seen lurking about the castle grounds in a suspicious manner the previous night. He found the doctor at his surgery looking harassed and guilty in equal measure, although when Hamish asked him directly about his nighttime visit to the castle, Dr. Brodie's shoulders sagged in defeat. "You'd better come with me," he said quietly. They drove in silence to a secluded spot near the old kirk, where Dr. Brodie led Hamish to a freshly disturbed patch of earth beneath a rowan tree. Without a word, the doctor produced a spade from his car boot and began to dig. 5 minutes later, he unearthed a burlap sack that was unmistakably stained with blood. Hamish's heart sank. This was looking very bad indeed. "Before you arrest me," Dr. Brodie said, "you might want to look inside." Hamish opened the sack to find not evidence of murder, but the remains of a magnificent Atlantic salmon, clearly poached and clearly the source of the bloodstains. "I caught it 3 nights ago," Dr. Brodie admitted. "In the Laird stretch of the river. Technically illegal, though every man in Loughdoob has done the same at one time or another. But with Sir Hugo making noises about enforcing the fishing rights, I thought it prudent to hide the evidence. So last night, when you were seen at the castle, I was burying the damned fish in what I thought was a discreet location. I'd kept it in my freezer, but my wife was asking questions and I panicked." The doctor looked thoroughly miserable. "I know how it looks, Hamish, sneaking about at night with a blood-stained sack, but I swear to you, I haven't killed anything more significant than a fish." Hamish stood in the drizzle, looking at the deceased salmon and contemplating the peculiarities of Highland life. By the strict letter of the law, he should report this poaching incident. Yet as by the unwritten rules that actually governed places like Loughdoob, he should do exactly what every sensible person did when faced with such minor transgressions. Ignore it. "I never saw this," Hamish said finally, "and you're going to rebury that fish somewhere less obvious and stop giving the gossips material to work with. Understood?" The relief on Dr. Brodie's face was profound. "Understood. Thank you, Hamish. And next time you fancy a bit of salmon, try the fish shop like everyone else." As he drove back to the village, Hamish reflected that while he'd eliminated one false lead, he was no closer to finding the real killer. The case was becoming a maze of dead ends and false trails, and somewhere in the middle of it all Archie MacLean sat in a cell for a crime he didn't commit. The afternoon brought another unexpected development. Hamish was at his desk writing up his notes when he saw a familiar figure trudging through the rain toward his door. Callum Stirling, the estranged nephew, looked considerably less composed than he had during his interview with Blair. "Mr. Macbeth, might I have a word?" Hamish ushered him inside and offered tea, which Callum accepted gratefully. The younger man was in his mid-30s, well-dressed but with the kind of worry lines that suggested recent financial troubles. "I understand I'm a suspect," Callum began without preamble, "and I don't blame you. My uncle and I had a very public argument, and I stood to inherit his estate. You have an alibi." "I do, but I wanted to tell you something that I didn't mention to that Inspector Blair. My uncle called me the night he died." Hamish sat up straighter. "What time?" 9:30. I was in my car driving back to Edinburgh. He was different, excited, almost manic. He said he'd found something important in the castle records, something that changed everything. Did he say what? No. He was being cryptic, the way he always was when he thought he had leverage over someone. He said I should come back to Loughdoob the next day, that we could discuss my inheritance after all. I thought he was playing games, trying to manipulate me. So I told him what he could do with his inheritance and hung up. "And that was the last time you spoke to him?" Callum nodded miserably. "When I heard he'd been murdered, I thought perhaps I should have taken him seriously. Maybe if I'd gone back that night. You'd have had no alibi and would likely be in the cell next to Archie McLean, Hamish finished. Did your uncle mention who else knew about this discovery? No, but he laughed when he said it. That horrible, smug laugh he had when he thought he'd got one over on someone. After Callum left, Hamish sat in thought. So Hugo had found something in the castle records, something significant enough to change his mind about his nephew's inheritance. And then, a few hours later, someone had killed him in that locked library. The records. It always came back to those old documents. He was reaching for his phone to call Mary Ross, who would know more about historical records than anyone, when he saw movement outside his window. It was Angus MacDonald, the old seer, making his way through the rain with the determined stride of a man on a mission. "I've had another vision," Angus announced the moment Hamish opened the door, water streaming from his ancient coat. "Have you now?" Hamish said without enthusiasm. "Aye. The spirit showed me something important. That Englishman wasn't killed for revenge or money or any of the obvious reasons. He was killed to protect a secret buried in the past." "That's very cryptic, Angus." "The spirits don't deal in specifics, laddie, but I'll tell you this. The person who killed him knew that castle like the back of their hand, knew it from long ago, before Sir Hugo ever set foot in it." After the old man left, still muttering about visions and spirits, Hamish made himself another cup of tea and stared out at the rain. Angus might be a fraud, but he had an uncanny knack for being right, even if he dressed it up in mystical nonsense. Someone who knew the castle from long ago, someone who had access to it before Sir Hugo arrived, someone who understood its secrets. The list of possibilities was growing shorter, and Hamish didn't like where it was pointing. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets of Lochdew clean while leaving its secrets stubbornly intact. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. The rain had finally stopped, leaving Lochdew washed clean and glistening under a pale sun that seemed surprised to find itself visible. Hamish spent the morning methodically checking alibis, a task as tedious as counting sheep but considerably more necessary. He started with Reverend Wellington, who confirmed that Dr. Brodie had indeed been playing bridge with him on the night of the murder, along with 2 church elders whose idea of excitement was a particularly daring bid of 3-no trump. "We started at 8 and finished just after midnight," the Reverend said, consulting a small diary he kept for such occasions. Dr. Brodie was in fine form, though he did have rather too much of the whisky. His wife will have words with him about that, I expect. He didn't leave at any point. Only to use the facilities, and that was well accounted for. We were in the middle of a rubber, and he hurried back lest we continue without him. The man takes his bridge very seriously. So Dr. Brodie's alibi was solid, which Hamish had expected. The doctor might have motive, but he lacked the calculating ruthlessness required for this particular murder. Next, Hamish tracked down the pub landlord Donald again, this time armed with more pointed questions about the night Archie spent in the cellar. "You said you heard noises at 10 o'clock. Are you certain of the time?" Donald nodded firmly. "I was changing the barrels, which I always do at 10 on the dot. Heard scraping and shuffling from the corner where those blankets are. I called out, 'Archie, is that you?' and heard a sort of grunt in response. That was good enough for me. And you're certain he was there the whole night?" "Well, I locked up at 11 and went to bed in my rooms upstairs, but I'm a light sleeper, and the cellar door creaked something terrible. If anyone had opened it during the night, I'd have heard." This was good news for Archie, though Hamish knew Blair would find some way to dismiss it. The detective chief inspector had committed himself to Archie's guilt with the kind of stubborn certainty that would take a crowbar to dislodge. Hamish's next stop was Strathbane, where he persuaded Jimmy Anderson to show him the traffic camera footage that provided Callum Sterling's alibi. They sat in a small office, watching grainy video of Callum's distinctive Mercedes passing through a camera checkpoint on the Edinburgh Road at 9:45. "The pathologist puts death between 9 and midnight, Jimmy said. Even if Callum turned around immediately after passing this camera, he couldn't have got back to Lochdew before 10:30 at the earliest, and there's more footage showing him entering Edinburgh at 11:15. So he's definitely out." "Aye. which leaves us with nobody, really. Archie was in the pub cellar, Dr. Brodie was playing bridge, Callum was miles away. The other names in that ledger all have alibis too, I checked. What about motive beyond blackmail? Did Sir Hugo have enemies in London? Plenty, according to the financial investigators, but they were all accounted for that night. Business rivals, here former employees he'd sacked, investors he'd cheated. All of them were provably elsewhere when he died. Hamish drove back to Lochdoub feeling the weight of the investigation pressing down on him like the Highland fog. Every suspect he investigated turned out to have an ironclad alibi. It was as though the murder had been committed by a ghost. He was passing the library when he saw Mary Ross locking the door, a stack of books under her arm. She looked tired, he thought, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested sleepless nights. "Mrs. Ross, are you well?" She startled slightly, then smiled. "Oh, Mr. Macbeth, yes, I'm fine. Just a bit troubled by all this business. Murder in Lochdoub, it seems impossible, doesn't it?" "I'm afraid it's very possible. Mrs. Ross, I need to ask you something. That night Sir Hugo died. Where were you?" Her smile faltered. "At home, I'm afraid. I live alone, so I have no one to vouch for me. I was reading, then went to bed early, around 9 o'clock. Did you see or hear anything unusual?" "No, nothing. My cottage is at the far end of the village, well away from the castle. I didn't know anything was wrong until Mrs. Wellington came by the next morning to tell me." She shifted the books in her arms. "Am I a suspect, Mr. Macbeth?" "Everyone's a suspect until I can eliminate them," Hamish said, trying to sound official. "It's nothing personal." "Of course, I understand." But she looked hurt nonetheless, and Hamish felt a pang of guilt for questioning someone who had been nothing but helpful throughout the investigation. That evening Hamish laid out all his notes on the kitchen table, much to the interest of Lugs, who tried to lie down on them. Sonsi observed from her perch on the windowsill, her yellow eyes unblinking. "Right then," Hamish said to his audience, "let's think this through logically. The locked room was the key. However the killer had managed it, they'd either found a way to bolt the door from outside or had been hiding in the room all along and escaped later. But the room had been searched thoroughly, and there were no hiding places large enough for a person. Unless the killer had been smaller than average. A child, perhaps, or a very slight adult. Hamish thought of Mary Ross, who was barely 5 feet tall and as thin as a willow branch. She could have hidden behind the heavy curtains or squeezed into the space behind one of the bookcases. But why would she? Or what possible motive could the gentle village librarian have for murdering Sir Hugo Sterling? He was still pondering this when his telephone rang. It was Jimmy Anderson, and he sounded excited. "Hamish, I've been going through Sir Hugo's phone records. That call to his nephew wasn't the only one he made that night. He made another call at 10:15 just before he died." "To whom?" "That's the interesting bit. It was to a Strathbane solicitor named Macpherson. I spoke to him this afternoon. Sir Hugo wanted to arrange an urgent meeting the next day to discuss changing his will and transferring ownership of some property. Macpherson said Sir Hugo sounded pleased with himself, almost gloating." "Did he say what property?" "No. But he mentioned he'd discovered that the castle had previous owners with surviving descendants who might have a legitimate claim to it. He wanted to research the legal implications." Hamish felt something click into place in his mind. Previous owners with surviving descendants. The castle had been in the hands of various Highland families over the centuries before falling into neglect and eventually being sold to Sir Hugo. "Jimmy, do you have a list of the castle's previous owners?" "Not to hand, but I can get one." "Why?" "Just a hunch. Can you send it to me when you find it?" After hanging up, Hamish sat very still, thinking. Someone who knew the castle from long ago. Someone familiar with its layout, who could navigate the dark corridors and knew where the heritage displays were kept. Someone who might have a legitimate claim to the property. He thought of Mary Ross, who had spent her youth researching local history, who had visited the castle for her work, who knew its every corner, who had mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd spent many happy afternoons in that very library where Sir Hugo had died. But Mary was the peacemaker, the kind soul who brought scones and tea, who comforted Mrs. Dunn and helped the investigation. She couldn't possibly be a murderer. Could she? Hamish looked at his notes again, this time searching for any mention of Mary's own history. He realised, with a start, that he knew almost nothing about her background. She'd been the village librarian for as long as anyone could remember, but where had she come from? Who were her family? He needed to dig deeper, but carefully. If his suspicions were correct, Mary Ross was not the simple, harmless woman she appeared to be. And if she had managed to fool the entire village for years, she was far more dangerous than anyone realised. Outside, the sun had set, and the village was settling into its evening routine. Lights glowed in cottage windows, smoke rose from chimneys, and the loch lay dark and still under the stars. Somewhere in this peaceful scene was a killer, and Hamish was beginning to understand that the most dangerous people were often those who appeared the most harmless. The sweetest faces sometimes hid the darkest secrets. Chapter 8. The Librarian's Flaw. Hamish woke before dawn, his mind already working through the problem of Mary Ross. He made tea and sat at his kitchen table with the first light creeping through the windows, reviewing everything he knew about the librarian. It wasn't much. She'd been in Lochdoub for at least 20 years, possibly longer. She was quiet, competent, universally liked. She lived alone in a small cottage and seemed to have no family. Beyond that, she was almost invisible, the way truly clever people often are. He pulled out the timeline Mary herself had provided to Blair on the morning of the murder. It listed everyone Sir Hugo had quarrelled with, along with times and places. Hamish had barely glanced at it before, trusting in Mary's thoroughness and accuracy. Now he studied it carefully, uncross-referencing it with his own notes and the statements he'd gathered. Most of it was accurate, meticulously so. But there was one small anomaly that made him sit up straighter. Mary had noted that Sir Hugo was researching a historical deed regarding the harbour property rights, specifically the 1782 Charter of Angus Mackenzie. She'd written that Sir Hugo had requested this document from her on the afternoon before his death. The problem was, Hamish had once helped Mary catalogue the library's collection after a minor flood, and he distinctly remembered her mentioning that the 1782 Charter had been destroyed in a fire at the Old Town Hall in 1965. She'd been quite sad about it, calling it an irreplaceable piece of local history. So either Mary's memory was faulty, or she deliberately included a false detail in her timeline. And Hamish didn't think Mary Ross's memory was faulty about anything. He was still pondering this when his mobile phone buzzed with a text from Jimmy Anderson. The list of previous castle owners had arrived. Hamish scrolled through the document, his heart sinking with each name. The castle had passed through many hands over the centuries: MacDonald, Campbell, Fraser, MacLeod. And then, in 1952, it had been purchased by a businessman named Robert McTavish, who had owned it until his bankruptcy and suicide in 1968. McTavish. Hamish pulled up the electoral roll on his computer and searched for anyone named McTavish currently living in Lochdoub. There was only one: Mary McTavish Ross. He sat back in his chair, feeling as though he'd been punched in the stomach. Mary's maiden name was McTavish. The castle had belonged to her family before Sir Hugo's father had bankrupted them. Suddenly, pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Mary's intimate knowledge of the castle, her interest in local history and old property deeds, her helpful involvement in the investigation, always there to steer things in the right direction, always ready with suggestions and theories. She'd been hiding in plain sight all along, the perfect embodiment of the harmless, helpful witness who turns out to be anything but. Hamish needed more evidence before he could act. He drove to the castle, hoping to search the library one more time without attracting Blair's attention. He was in luck. The Strathbane team had mostly packed up, leaving only a single constable on guard duty. "Just need to check something for my report," Hamish told the young officer, who waved him through with bored indifference. In the library, Hamish went straight to the spot where he had found the red wool fibre. He examined the flagstones again, this time paying attention not just to the crack, but to the pattern of wear around it. One stone was slightly cleaner than the others, as though it had been moved recently. He tried to pry it up, but it was stuck fast. Then he noticed something he had missed before. Tiny scratch marks along one edge, barely visible unless you were looking for them. Someone had used a tool to lever this stone up, and recently. But why? There was nothing underneath but earth and centuries-old mortar. Unless there had been something hidden there, something small and valuable, something worth killing for. He photographed the stone and the scratch marks, then moved to the bookshelves where the hidden safe had been found. The safe itself had been removed as evidence, but Hamish examined the books that had surrounded it. Most were old volumes on Scottish history, their spines cracked with age. One book caught his attention, a slim volume on just archival preservation techniques. It seemed out of place among the historical texts. He pulled it out and found, pressed between the pages, a tiny smear of what looked like conservation glue, the specialised adhesive used to repair old documents. The same type of glue Mary would use in her work as librarian. Hamish was returning the book to its place when he noticed something else, a scrap of paper no bigger than a fingernail wedged behind the bookshelf. He extracted it carefully with his penknife. It was a corner torn from a piece of vellum, the expensive archival quality paper used for preserving historical documents. The fragment bore part of a wax seal, red and official looking. Mary had access to vellum. Mary knew how to work with historical documents and seals. And if Hamish's growing suspicion was correct, Mary had been searching for something in this library, something her family had hidden decades ago. He needed to confront her, but carefully. If she had killed once, she might kill again if cornered. First, though, he needed to understand her motive completely. He drove to Strathbane and spent 2 hours in the registry office, digging through old records. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Robert MacTavish had purchased Lochdoub Castle in 1952, pouring his fortune into its restoration. But in 1967, he'd entered into a business partnership with Hugo Sterling Sr., father of the murdered man. Sterling Sr. had systematically defrauded MacTavish, leaving him bankrupt and disgraced. In 1968, Robert MacTavish had taken his own life. His widow had died a year later, leaving behind a young daughter named Mary, who had been raised by relatives and eventually returned to Lochdoub under her married name of Ross. She'd come back to the place where her father had died in shame, taken a quiet job as a librarian and waited. Waited for decades, perhaps, for the chance to reclaim what was hers. And then Hugo Sterling Jr. had bought the castle, the final insult from the family that had destroyed hers. Hamish's phone rang. It was the pub landlord Donald, sounding flustered. "Hamish. You'd better come quick. There's been another incident at the castle. Someone's ransacked Mrs. Dunn's cottage." Hamish arrived to find Mrs. Dunn in tears and Blair already on the scene, blustering about security and incompetence. The cottage had been thoroughly searched, drawers pulled out, cushions upturned. "They were looking for something," Mrs. Dunn sobbed, "but I don't know what. I don't have anything valuable." "Did you keep any papers from the castle?" Hamish asked. "Any old documents?" "Just the keys and some household accounts. Nothing important." But Hamish noticed something. On the mantelpiece sat a framed photograph of Mrs. Dunn as a young woman, standing in front of the castle with an older couple. "Who are they?" Hamish asked, pointing to the couple. "The old Laird and his wife, the MacTavishes. I was in service to them before," she trailed off sadly, "before the Troubles." "Did they give you anything to keep safe? Anything at all?" Mrs. Dunn hesitated. "There was a small box. Mrs. MacTavish gave it to me the day before Mr. MacTavish died. Said it was family jewellery to keep it from the creditors. I've had it all these years, tucked away in my attic. I'd forgotten all about it until you asked." "Is it still there?" "I don't know. I haven't checked. Shall I look?" They climbed to the attic together, Blair puffing along behind them. The box was gone, along with a small trunk that had contained other MacTavish family belongings. "When did you last see these items?" Hamish asked. "Not for years. I never had cause to go through them. Hamish felt the pieces clicking together. Mary had been searching for her family's hidden jewellery, the last remnants of their fortune. Sir Hugo must have discovered the truth about the castle's previous owners and realised there were valuables still hidden somewhere. He'd called his solicitor, perhaps planning to use this knowledge as leverage, and Mary had killed him to protect her secret and claim what was rightfully hers. There was only one problem. Hamish had no proof that would stand up in court. He needed Mary to make a mistake, to reveal herself. He thought of the red wool fibre he had found. Mary often wore a red cardigan. It was a small thing, almost meaningless on its own, but combined with everything else. As Blair continued to rail at Mrs. Dunn about security, Hamish quietly excused himself and walked back toward the village, his mind already forming a plan. No, it was time to set a trap for the librarian. Chapter 9. Sins of the Past. Hamish spent the evening researching, making phone calls, and piecing together the tragic history of the McTavish family. What emerged was a story of greed, betrayal, and a father's desperate attempt to protect his family's legacy. Robert McTavish had been a respected businessman, proud of his Highland heritage and delighted to own the ancestral castle that had once belonged to distant relatives. He'd poured money into restoring it, filling it with period furniture and creating a small museum of local history in the library. Then he'd made the fatal mistake of trusting Hugo Sterling Sr. The partnership had seemed legitimate at first. Sterling proposed a series of investments that promised substantial returns. By the time McTavish realised he'd been swindled, it was too late. His fortune was gone. The castle was mortgaged to the hilt, and his reputation was in ruins. According to the newspaper archives, Robert McTavish had hanged himself in the castle library, the same room where his tormentor's son would die decades later. The symmetry of it made Hamish's skin crawl. He found an obituary for Mrs. McTavish, who had died of a heart attack in 1969, leaving behind a 10-year-old daughter named Mary. The girl had been sent to live with relatives in Inverness. The trail went cold after that, but Hamish could fill in the gaps easily enough. Mary had eventually married, become widowed, and returned to Lochdew under her married name. She'd taken the position of village librarian, a job that gave her access to all the historical records, all the property deeds, all the information she needed to plan her revenge. And she'd waited. Although patient as a spider in its web, she'd waited for the right moment. The next morning, Hamish paid a visit to the library. He found Mary at her desk, stamping returned books with her usual methodical precision. She looked up as he entered, her smile warm and welcoming. "Mr. Macbeth, how nice to see you. Have you come to borrow a book, or is this official business?" "A bit of both, actually. I need to look at some historical records. Property transfers from the 1960s, specifically relating to Lochdew Castle." Something flickered in her eyes, too quick to identify. "Of course. They're in the archive room. I'll show you." She led him to a small back room lined with filing cabinets and boxes of documents. The air smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Mary pulled out a drawer and extracted a folder. "Here are the castle documents, though I'm not sure what you're looking for. Just trying to understand the building's history, who owned it before Sir Hugo, that sort of thing. It went through several owners after the McTavish bankruptcy. None of them kept it long. Too expensive to maintain, I suppose. Then it sat empty for years before Hugo Sterling bought it." Her voice was perfectly neutral, but Hamish noticed her hands were clenched tightly around the folder. "You knew the McTavishes, didn't you, Mrs. Ross?" The folder slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the floor. For a moment her mask of calm competence cracked, and Hamish saw something fierce and wounded beneath. Yes, I was very young. My mother was acquainted with Mrs. McTavish. Your mother, not you yourself. I barely remember them." She knelt to gather the papers, not meeting his eyes. "It was a long time ago, Mr. Macbeth." Hamish knelt beside her, helping to collect the scattered documents. "Mary McTavish Ross," he said quietly. "You were their daughter." Her hand stilled. For a long moment she didn't move. Then, very slowly, she stood up, her face pale but composed. "How long have you known?" "Not long. The electoral roll, the registry office, the newspaper archives, the pieces came together." "I see." She moved to the window, looking out at the village she'd called home for so many years. "I suppose you think I killed him." "Did you?" She turned to face him, and her expression was utterly changed. The gentle librarian was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. "Hugo Sterling destroyed my family. His father bankrupted mine, drove my father to suicide. I killed my mother with grief and stress. I was 10 years old when I lost everything. My home, my parents, my entire world. I was shunted off to relatives who didn't want me, raised on charity and pity. So you came back, changed your name, bided your time. I came back to reclaim what was mine. The castle belonged to my family for generations before my father bought it. The Sterlings stole it from us, just like they stole everything else. And when Sir Hugo arrived, I was patient. I thought he might sell eventually, move on to easier targets, but then he started going through the old records and I realised he'd found something. My father hid our family jewellery. Not much, but all we had left. Somewhere in the castle before he died. He left clues in the property documents, thinking I'd come back one day and understand. And Sir Hugo figured it out." Mary's laugh was bitter. "Oh, he was clever, I'll give him that. Cleverer than his father, anyway. He pieced together the clues, realised who I was, and decided to toy with me. Do you know what he said when he confronted me? He said I could buy the jewellery back from him, buy back my own family heirlooms with money I didn't have. So you killed him." I went to the castle that night to plead with him one last time. I used the servants' entrance. I still had a key from when I used to visit as a child, and no one had ever thought to change the locks. Hugo was in the library, surrounded by papers, gloating over his discoveries. "We argued," he laughed at me, "called my father a fool and a coward." Her voice had gone flat, emotionless, as though she were recounting someone else's story. "I saw the peat cutter on display. It was one of my father's pieces, part of his beloved heritage collection. The irony was too perfect. I picked it up and hit him. Just once. He fell and I knew immediately he was dead. The locked door? I bolted it from inside and climbed out the window. There's a narrow ledge that runs along the exterior wall, something I knew about from my childhood. I edged along it to the next room, which has a much lower window, and climbed down using the old wisteria vine. Then I went home and waited for someone to find him. Hamish felt a wave of sadness wash over him. This gentle woman who had served the village so faithfully, who had brought scones and comfort and tea, had been carrying a lifetime of grief and rage beneath her quiet exterior. "Did you find the jewellery?" "Yes. It was hidden under a loose flagstone in the library, right where my father's clues said it would be. I went back the night after the murder and retrieved it. Later, I took the other family items from Mrs. Dunn's attic, things that had been in storage all these years. And the false information in the timeline you gave to Blair, the reference to the destroyed charter." Mary smiled, a terrible smile that held no warmth. "I wanted to see if you'd notice, if anyone would notice, but Blair was too busy with his easy suspects, and you—" She paused. "You were the only one who looked closely enough. I suppose I'm almost glad it was you who worked it out. I'll have to arrest you, Mary. I know." She moved away from the window with surprising calm, as though she'd been expecting this moment all along. "But tell me, Hamish, and I know you well enough to use your first name now, was I wrong? Hugo Sterling was a monster, just like his father. He destroyed lives for profit and pleasure. The world is better without him. That's not for you to decide, isn't it? My father decided to end his own life rather than live with shame. My mother decided her broken heart wasn't worth mending. Hugo Sterling decided that money mattered more than human decency. We all make decisions, Hamish. Mine was simply more permanent than most." She held out her wrists, ready for handcuffs, her face serene. The battle was over, and in some strange way she seemed almost relieved. "I've been waiting for this day for 38 years, she said softly. "I think I'm ready for it to be finished." Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. Hamish sat in the library's back room with Mary Ross, neither of them moving, the silence stretching between them like a rope pulled taut. Outside, the village went about its business, unaware that its gentle librarian was a confessed murderer. "I need to make a phone call," Hamish said finally. "To Detective Chief Inspector Blair?" Mary's voice held a trace of amusement. "He'll be insufferable, won't he? Finally getting to arrest someone from Loch-Dubh for murder." "Aye, he will at that." Hamish stood up slowly, his mind working through the angles of the situation. "But before I do, I need to ask you something. Where is the jewellery now?" "In my cottage, hidden in a tea tin in the kitchen cupboard." Not very imaginative, I know. But sometimes the obvious places are the safest. She looked at him curiously. "Why does it matter?" "Because Blair will tear your cottage apart looking for evidence, and I'd rather know what he's going to find." Always thinking ahead, aren't you, Hamish? That's why you're good at this, even though you pretend otherwise. Hamish ignored the compliment. "There's something else. The red wool fibre I found by the fireplace. It came from your cardigan, didn't it? The one I was wearing that night. I caught it on the edge of the flagstone when I was retrieving the jewellery. I noticed a thread was pulled, but didn't think anyone would find it." She smiled sadly. "I should have known you would." "And the archival glue I found on the bookshelf? From my gloves. I wore conservation gloves when I handled the old documents. Searching for my father's clues, I must have brushed against the shelf." She shook her head. "Careless of me. But then, I never expected anyone to look that closely." Hamish pulled out his phone, but before he could dial, Mary spoke again. "Wait, there's something you should know. In my cottage, in the bottom drawer of my desk, there's a full written confession. I prepared it weeks ago, just in case. It details everything. How I planned it, how I executed it, why I did it. I wanted there to be a record, something that told my father's story properly. Why didn't you just turn yourself in? Because I'm a coward, I suppose. Or perhaps I wanted to see if I could get away with it. Either way, the confession is there if you need it." Hamish made his phone call, not to Blair directly, but to Jimmy Anderson. "Jimmy, I need you to come to the Loch-Dubh library. I've solved the case." "You have? Thank God. Blair's been like a bear with a sore head ever since the Archie arrest fell apart. Who is it?" "I'll explain when you get here. And Jimmy? Bring Blair with you, but let me handle the initial interview. I'll make sure he gets all the credit." "All the credit? Hamish, are you feeling well?" "Never better. Just trust me on this." While they waited for the Strathbane police to arrive, Hamish walked through the library with Mary, letting her show him the various documents and records she'd used to piece together the mystery of her family's hidden valuables. "My father was a clever man," she said, running her fingers over an old property deed. "He knew the Sterlings would take everything, so he left me clues, little notes in the margins of documents. Dates that were slightly wrong, references to poems and songs we used to share. It took me years to decipher them all, but eventually I understood. The jewellery was under the flagstone near the fireplace, exactly where we used to sit together when I was a child, and he told me stories about our ancestors. He loved you very much. Yes, and I loved him, which is why I couldn't let Hugo Sterling mock his memory." Her composure finally cracked just a little. "Is that so terrible, Hamish? To want justice for your father? Justice is one thing, murder is another. I suppose so, though I'm not sure I see much difference." Blair arrived 40 minutes later, puffing and red-faced, with Jimmy Anderson trailing behind, looking curious. The Detective Chief Inspector was in a foul mood, and having just had his case against Archie McLean officially dismissed. "This had better be good, Macbeth," he snarled. "I've wasted enough time on this god-forsaken village." "Oh, I think you'll be pleased, sir," Hamish said mildly. "I've found your killer. Mrs. Mary Ross has confessed to the murder of Sir Hugo Sterling." Blair's jaw dropped. "The librarian? Don't be daft." "She's already confessed to me, and there's a written statement in her cottage that corroborates everything, plus physical evidence, fibres, glue traces, and her intimate knowledge of the castle's layout, including the lead she used to escape from the locked library. Hamish proceeded to lay out the case, carefully steering the narrative so that it appeared Blair's investigation had naturally led to this conclusion. He mentioned the blackmail ledger that Blair had found, the forensic evidence from the library, the mysterious previous owners that the Strathbane team had researched. Of course, it was your thoroughness in investigating the castle's history that cracked it wide open, sir, Hamish said smoothly. Once we knew about the McTavish connection, everything else fell into place. Blair's expression gradually shifted from suspicion to smugness. I had my suspicions about the helpful types. Too eager to please, that's always a warning sign. Jimmy Anderson caught Hamish's eye and gave him a look that said clearly, "You're laying it on a bit thick." But Blair was swallowing it whole. Right then, "Mrs. Ross, I'm arresting you for the murder of Sir Hugo Sterling. You do not have to say anything." As Blair went through the formalities, clearly relishing every moment, Hamish retrieved the evidence from Mary's cottage. The jewellery, the confession, the red cardigan with its telltale pulled thread. He bagged everything carefully and handed it to Jimmy, who took it with a sympathetic nod. "She seems very calm," Jimmy observed quietly, almost relieved. "I think she's been waiting for this for a long time," Hamish replied. The weight of what she'd done, carrying it alone, that's its own kind of prison. By evening, Mary was in custody in Strathbane, and Blair was holding a press conference taking full credit for solving the complex locked room murder. The television cameras loved him, and he preened for them like a peacock in a policeman's uniform. Hamish watched it all from his croft house, lugs at his feet and Sonsi on his lap, a cup of tea growing cold on the table beside him. "Well, that's that," he said to his animals. "Blair gets his glory, I keep my quiet life, and Mary Ross gets whatever she gets." The phone rang. It was the superintendent from Strathbane, his voice heavy with false regret. "Macbeth, I've been reviewing your performance on this case. Here it comes," Hamish thought. "The promotion I don't want." Detective Chief Inspector Blair has made it clear that while you provided some assistance with local knowledge, you showed a distinct lack of initiative and ambition. You failed to identify the killer until Blair's superior detective work forced the confession. "Yes, sir. I'm afraid I wasn't much help." "Quite. Therefore I'm afraid we cannot recommend you for promotion at this time. You'll remain as constable in Lochdoub for the foreseeable future." "That's very disappointing, sir," Hamish said, trying to keep the relief out of his voice. "Yes, well, perhaps if you apply yourself more diligently in future. Good night, Macbeth." Hamish hung up the phone and allowed himself a small smile. He'd solved the case, saved an innocent man from jail, given Blair the credit to keep him happy, and successfully avoided a promotion to Strathbane. All in all, a satisfactory outcome. He made himself a plate of sandwiches and shared them with Lugs, while Sonsi watched with her usual disdainful expression. Outside, night had fallen over Lochdoub, and the village was peaceful once more. Hamish thought about Mary Ross sitting in a cell in Strathbane. She'd murdered a man for revenge and to reclaim her family's honour. The law would punish her for it, and rightly so. But Hamish couldn't help feeling a pang of sympathy for the lonely child who'd lost everything and spent her whole life planning to get it back. Justice, he reflected, was a complicated thing. The law was clear enough. Murder was murder, regardless of motive. But the human heart was messier, full of old wounds and desperate needs that the law couldn't quite account for. Still, that wasn't his problem anymore. He'd done his job, maintained the peace, and protected his beloved village from both murderers and unwanted promotions. He broke off a piece of shortbread and shared it between Lugs and Sonsi, then settled into his chair with a satisfied sigh. Tomorrow he would tend his sheep, avoid his paperwork, and enjoy the quiet rhythms of Highland life. The murder was solved. The killer was caught, and Lochdoub could return to its usual peaceful routine. And if there was a small voice in the back of his mind that wondered if Mary Ross might have had a point about Hugo Sterling deserving what he got, well, Hamish Macbeth was very good at ignoring inconvenient thoughts. Outside, the wind whispered across the loch, carrying with it the faint scent of peat smoke and heather. The stars came out, bright and cold, and somewhere in the distance a sheep bleated contentedly. All was well in Loch Dhu, for now.